In the final weeks of October 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal were black and restless, a dark mirror reflecting the exhaustion of two fleets locked in a struggle neither had expected to last this long. The Pacific air was heavy with the scent of rain and salt, and the nights belonged to Japan. For months, their destroyers had ruled these seas with disciplined precision, slipping through the darkness to deliver shells and torpedoes into American lines before vanishing like ghosts. The Americans had come to call it the Tokyo Express, but for those aboard the thin picket lines of cruisers and destroyers guarding Henderson Field, it was something else, a nightly haunting. The Japanese had mastered the art of fighting where the human eye failed. Their lookouts could read the horizon by the faintest starlight. Their gunners could fire by instinct, and their torpedoes, the long, lethal Type 93s, moved unseen beneath the waves, leaving only columns of flame and screams in their wake. By early November, Guadalcanal had become more than an island. It was a measure of will. Whoever controlled its small airstrip would control the South Pacific supply arteries and thus the tempo of the war itself. The Americans held the airfield, but barely. Every night the Japanese landed more troops, more artillery, more desperation. The sea routes around the island were alive with transports, destroyers, and cruisers moving under the cover of blackness, while by day, American aircraft struck from the patch of coral and mud known as Henderson Field, clawing at every convoy they could find. The front line was no longer a trench or a hill. It was the water itself, shifting and hostile, ruled by whoever dared to see through the dark first. On the evening of November 12th, a new ship slid through the Black Pacific swells south of Savo Island, a massive American battleship, her deck lights extinguished, her bridge illuminated only by the dim red glow of instruments. She was the USS Washington, a vessel built not just of steel and armor, but of experiment. Hidden deep within her superstructure was something almost no other ship in the Pacific yet possessed. A functional SG radar system capable of detecting a moving vessel in total darkness. To most of the fleet, radar was still a curiosity, unreliable and confusing. To a handful of officers, it was a weapon more powerful than armor or speed, a way to fight in the night without sight, to make the invisible visible. Far ahead, the Japanese were already moving. Their force was larger. 2 battleships, a screen of cruisers, and destroyers designed for swift, silent killing. They expected another easy night raid, another chance to remind the Americans that darkness was their ally. But in the shadow of Savo Island, the balance was changing. Beneath the steady hum of machinery and the quiet breathing of crews at their stations, something revolutionary was awakening. A contest between vision born of the human eye and the ghostly precision of electronic pulses, echoing unseen across the Black Sea. The night ahead would not belong to numbers, nor to courage alone. It would belong to whoever could see through the dark first. And in that darkness, the new radar screens aboard Washington began to glow.
Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee was not a man who inspired speeches. He was short, round-faced, soft-spoken, a quiet Kentuckian whose hands looked more suited for holding a rifle than a fleet's destiny. Yet those who served under him understood that behind his modest manners was an intellect forged by precision and patience. Long before radar was whispered about in the Navy circles, Lee had been a student of weapons, not in the romantic sense of battle, but in the mathematical language of velocity, distance, and timing. He had won trophies for marksmanship as a young officer, and he treated naval gunnery as an exact science, not a spectacle. Where others saw guns as instruments of destruction, Lee saw systems of cause and consequence, a chain of reactions that could be shortened, refined, made faster than human hesitation. His experience was not shaped by theory, but by decades of drilling crews, adjusting gunfire tables, and questioning traditions older than the ships themselves. In the Pacific, he watched destroyers die because messages traveled too slowly, from radar to bridge, from bridge to gunnery, from gunnery to turret. Seconds lost, lives lost. So he began to change things quietly, sometimes against procedure. On Washington, he rewrote the firing sequence, cutting out layers of command that had once been sacred. The gunnery officer now spoke directly to the plotting room. Radar operators could relay target bearings straight to the directors without waiting for optical confirmation. He called it practical gunnery, but his subordinates understood it as revolution. Every night, while most ships in the fleet powered down their equipment to save the generators, Lee kept Washington's radar running. He wanted his men to trust it, to treat its green phosphorescent traces as real as the horizon. He made them practice in the dark. No lights, no lookouts, only the faint hum of machinery and the electronic heartbeat of the new device. The radar men, most of them barely out of training school, learned to read the sea in glowing arcs. They tracked merchant ships in mock drills, plotted imaginary torpedo runs, and whispered bearings into headsets while Lee stood silently behind them, listening, noting every hesitation. He believed technology was only as strong as the people who served it. A radar set was not an oracle. It was a tool that required discipline sharper than eyesight. Under his command, the Washington's crew became a hybrid force, part guns, part wires, part faith in something invisible. The battleship's bridge transformed into a silent observatory of light and sound, where information flowed not through shouted orders, but through numbers and calm voices. His fellow officers found him distant, almost detached, yet his sailors trusted him completely. They said he never raised his voice, never promised victory, only preparedness. As November nights grew longer and darker, the Japanese raids intensified. Destroyers bled and vanished one by one. Cruisers limped home trailing fire. The fleet's morale was stretched thin. But aboard Washington, there was a sense of readiness that bordered on defiance. The admiral spoke little, yet his calm steadied them more than any speech could. He had studied the Japanese Navy, its tactics, its obsession with night fighting. He understood that they believed darkness was their natural element. He intended to change that belief forever. Now, as the order came to move north toward Iron Bottom Sound, the admiral stood on the flag bridge, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the radar scope. Outside, the sea was black glass, the sky heavy with cloud. The Japanese fleet was somewhere ahead, larger, faster, confident in its invisibility. But the admiral did not squint into the dark. His eyes were fixed on the soft green curve of the screen, where faint echoes began to bloom like ghosts emerging from the deep. He knew what it meant. The night would soon belong to whoever trusted their instruments more than their fear. And Lee, calm, precise, quietly determined, was about to prove that vision no longer depended on light.
The night of November 14, 1942, fell heavy over Iron Bottom Sound, the patch of ocean whose name had already been written by burning ships and drowned men. Rain drifted in thin, hesitant curtains, too light to cool the heat of machinery below decks, but thick enough to swallow every star. The USS Washington led her formation, destroyers fanning ahead like lean, nervous hounds, while behind her the South Dakota followed, dark and silent, her engines throbbing under heavy load. No one spoke above a whisper. The men on the bridge listened to the rhythm of the engines the way soldiers listen to breathing before battle, knowing that soon every vibration would matter. In the forward radar compartment, red light bathed the faces of young operators who stared at the glowing circular screen that pulsed like a heartbeat. The radar hummed, sweeping its invisible finger through the void, turning silence into geometry. Blips appeared and faded, then appeared again, faint, uncertain, like ghosts unsure if they should be seen. Chief radar man Alan Ricks adjusted the gain, murmuring numbers to the plotters who copied them down. Range, bearing, movement. Somewhere out there, 30 miles north, the enemy was coming. Above them, Admiral Lee stood on the flag bridge beside Captain Davis. The Admiral's face was unreadable, illuminated only by the pale flicker of the radar repeater. "Contact, north by northwest," a voice said through the intercom. "Multiple returns, closing fast." Lee nodded once. "Maintain course," he said quietly. To those around him, the words sounded like a command wrapped in composure, but he was calculating furiously in silence. The Japanese would be entering from Savo Channel, using the island's silhouette to mask their approach. They believed they were unseen. They had been right every other night of the campaign, but not tonight. The destroyers ahead pushed into the darkness, their wakes invisible, their decks slick with rain. Every man on them knew what this meant. They were scouts, sacrificial in all but name. They would draw first blood, perhaps buy minutes of warning before the heavier ships behind them engaged. Lee had ordered radio silence. There would be no chatter, no fear transmitted over the airwaves. Only the sound of water breaking and the constant, steady ping of sonar beneath the hull. The Japanese believed darkness was their ally. The Americans now believed in something colder and more precise. Numbers on a screen. Impulses of electricity that no human eye could rival. At 20-30 hours, the radar picked up the first solid contacts, large shapes moving in formation. "Targets confirmed," the operator said. "Range 18,000 yards." Lee's hand rested lightly on the plotting table. "That's them," he said, almost to himself. The sea outside was black and soundless, yet on the scopes it came alive with movement. Cruisers, destroyers, a massive signature that could only be a battleship. The Admiral's jaw tightened. Kirishima, perhaps, or Kie, both veterans of earlier bombardments. They were coming to finish the airfield once and for all. On deck, gun crews waited beside turrets that loomed like dark mountains. The metal beneath their boots vibrated with tension. In the engine rooms, sailors stripped to their waists, slick with oil and sweat, listening to the distant commands echoing through steel corridors. In the plotting room, the data poured in faster now, targets splitting, converging, weaving like hunting wolves. Lee leaned closer to the repeater. "We have them," he said, his voice low and final. "They don't have us." The fleet slid forward into the void, invisible to the enemy's eyes. Every man felt it, the moment when fear hardened into focus, when the edge between waiting and fighting grew impossibly thin. Somewhere beyond the radar circle, Japanese searchlights would soon stab through the clouds, and the quiet geometry of the screens would turn into thunder. For now, though, there was only the hum of engines, the whisper of voices, and the green glow of discovery spreading across the dark Pacific. The radar pulse swept again, brighter this time. The operator looked up. "Range, closing, 16,000 yards." The Admiral nodded once, and the words carried through the ship like a current. "Battle stations, stand by to engage." And out there, somewhere in the unseen water, the enemy's torpedoes were already on their way. The sea erupted without warning. One moment the night was pure silence, then the horizon bloomed with light as Japanese searchlights tore through the darkness like blades. White beams crossed over black water, slicing through rain and smoke. The first shells screamed past Washington's bridge before anyone saw their tracers. They landed somewhere off the port bow with a concussion that shook the hull like a struck bell. The destroyers ahead were already engaged, their guns flashing in rapid, desperate rhythm. The Admiral didn't flinch. He moved closer to the plotting table, voice calm, every syllable exact. "Hold course. Do not return fire until radar solution confirmed." In those first minutes, chaos was absolute. The destroyers, thin-skinned, quick, fragile, darted into the storm of fire, trying to launch torpedoes before they died. Walk took a hit almost immediately, her forward magazine erupting in a flash that blinded everyone watching through binoculars. Preston followed, gutted by high explosive shells that turned her bridge into flame. The intercom crackled with partial reports, voices breaking, static thick with interference. Benham hit, steering gone, abandoning forward compartments. Then silence. Lee closed his eyes briefly and said nothing. The destroyers were buying him distance, trading their lives for his data. Radar still tracked the Japanese formation, 2 battleships and a dozen escorts, their positions flickering on the scopes like angry fireflies. The Admiral's staff worked with mechanical focus, feeding bearing and range to the gunnery computers. The air inside the plotting room was hot and metallic, filled with the smell of oil and sweat. Above deck, men could hear the sea hissing from exploding shells that fell close enough to scatter shrapnel across the superstructure. Captain Davis glanced toward Lee. "Permission to return fire?" he asked. Lee looked at the screen again, waited until the range ticked to 8,400 yards, then spoke with quiet finality. "Permission granted." Washington's main batteries opened with a sound that did not belong to this world, a deep, rolling concussion that tore through the ocean like thunder from the Earth's core. The blast wave shattered glass in the bridge. Even below decks, men felt the shock in their lungs. 3 16-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, leapt into the darkness guided not by eyes, but by the invisible pulse of the SG radar. The first salvo landed short, the second bracketed the target, and the third found it. Somewhere beyond the rain and smoke, a Japanese cruiser vanished in a flash of orange light, its ammunition stores erupting in a column that pierced the night like sunrise. But the destroyers ahead were gone. Their burning hulls drifted helplessly, red smears on the radar screen that faded one by one. South Dakota, following close behind, was hit hard. Japanese spotlights caught her massive silhouette, and within minutes she was struck by a dozen shells. Circuits shorted, communications died, her decks burning like a furnace. The sky above her turned crimson. Lee watched through the optical rangefinder, jaw tightening. She's lost her lights, and now she's a beacon. The Japanese focused their fury on her, mistaking her for the lead battleship. The Admiral made his choice. All ahead flank, turn to intercept. Washington surged forward, her engines roaring beneath the decks. The wake foamed white behind her as she broke from the smokescreen. For the first time in the battle, the flagship was alone, one ship against an entire task force. On the radar screen, the enemy formations converged, closing to within 7,000 yards. Every instinct told him to withdraw, to regroup, but the logic of battle had changed. The destroyers had died for time. South Dakota was burning, crippled. If he turned away now, the Japanese bombardment group would reach the airfield by dawn, and Guadalcanal would fall. He leaned over the intercom, his voice low but steady. "Bring the ship to target bearing 090. Fire control, maintain radar lock. We will engage the lead battleship." Around him, the bridge crew exchanged brief glances. They understood. The lead ship was Kirishima, one of the Imperial Navy's proudest warhorses, blooded in every major action since Pearl Harbor. The Admiral's eyes never left the glowing screen. He said quietly, "They have their lights. We have our eyes." Outside, the rain thickened again, blurring fire and horizon into one molten mass. Washington advanced through it, guns ready, radar painting the unseen world with cold precision. Behind her, the burning wrecks of the destroyers flickered out one by one, leaving nothing but darkness and silence except for the slow, growing hum of machinery preparing for the final exchange. The Admiral straightened, his silhouette framed against the green light of the radar scope. "This," he murmured, "is where we take back the night." And with that, Washington charged alone into the storm.
The black water ahead of Washington boiled with shellfire. Tracer lines crossed in erratic angles, white arcs slicing through the darkness like lightning that never reached the sky. The radar scope flickered with returns so close they almost merged into one glowing mass. Yet within that chaos, Admiral Lee saw order, a geometry of destruction that only he could read. The Japanese battleship Kirishima had revealed herself in a brief flash of her own gunfire. That light was her death sentence.
"Target confirmed," the gunnery officer said, his voice steady but trembling at the edge. "Range 8,000 yards and closing." Lee adjusted his glasses, leaned over the table, and spoke with quiet precision. "Plot continuous fire, ladder pattern, 2 gun salvos, maintain radar lock." Outside, invisible to the enemy's eyes, Washington advanced through the drifting smoke at 23 knots. Her radar beams pierced the night like threads of light no one could see, measuring distance, motion, intent. The fire control computers hummed as they fed range and bearing to the turrets. Every second mattered. The Admiral's fingers tapped once on the table, his only outward sign of tension. "Commence firing." The main guns answered with a detonation that seemed to tear the air apart. The ship shuddered from the recoil, her steel decks vibrating like a living thing. The first salvo landed close, geysers rising beside Kiroshima's hull. The second struck home. 3 shells hit her amidships almost simultaneously. Radar operators called in the hits in clipped tones, echo strength fading, target slowing. Then came the third salvo, and the Japanese flagship disappeared behind a tower of flame so bright it washed out the radar screens for a heartbeat. In that instant, the night ceased to belong to Japan. Kiroshima's return fire came late and wild, her gunners blinded by smoke and their own searchlights aimed at phantom silhouettes. Some shells passed harmlessly over Washington's stern, others plunged short into the sea. Lee refused to turn on his lights, refused to give them a target. "Keep radar tracking," he ordered. "She's burning. Finish her." The next salvo struck the forward magazines. A second explosion followed, deeper and slower like the groan of a dying animal. Through the periscope slit, observers could see her listing, fire spreading down her decks, explosions walking along her hull. But the danger was not over. Japanese destroyers rushed forward, their silhouettes darting in and out of the glare, loosing torpedoes in desperate arcs. "Torpedo tracks, bearing 270, someone shouted. Lee's mind moved faster than fear. Hard to port, full ahead. The massive battleship turned, her bow carving through waves as 2 torpedoes streaked past her stern, close enough for men on deck to see their wakes. The ship heeled, engines straining, then steadied. He exhaled once, a sound lost in the roar of machinery. For 20 minutes the night was a storm of thunder and flame. Washington fired 75 rounds from her main guns and hundreds from her secondary batteries. Japanese cruisers tried to intervene, but each time the radar tracked them before their eyes could adjust. The American shells fell with surgical precision. A cruiser vanished in a column of fire, another turned away, trailing smoke. The enemy formation broke apart, their discipline collapsing under invisible blows. The once invincible night fighters were blind. They fired wildly into the void, at phantoms that only existed on screens glowing green aboard Washington. Below decks, sailors worked in near darkness, drenched in sweat, passing shells, clearing smoke, tending to the wounded. The gun crews shouted coordinates, the loaders cursed through ringing ears, but the rhythm never faltered. It was a machine of men and steel, each part synchronized by trust in the Admiral's voice echoing through the ship, calm, deliberate, relentless. At 025, the radar operators reported the impossible. Main target stationary, breaking apart. Lee lifted his binoculars, though the world beyond the bridge was little more than flashes and silhouettes. For a brief moment he saw it, the enemy battleship rolling slowly, her deck aflame, her superstructure collapsing. Then she was gone, swallowed by the same blackness that had once protected her. Silence followed, eerie and complete, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. Lee looked toward South Dakota, still limping, smoke trailing from her hull. He knew her crew was alive, battered but breathing. The Japanese had turned away. The battle, against all logic, was theirs. The Admiral removed his glasses and wiped them with a cloth that shook slightly in his hand. Around him officers exhaled in disbelief. No cheers, no triumph. Just exhaustion and the stunned understanding that they had survived what should have killed them all. "Secure from general quarters," he said quietly. "Keep radar scanning. We don't assume victory until the sea says so." His eyes returned to the glowing screen, where the last of the enemy echoes faded into nothing. The night was still vast, still full of dangers, but for the first time since the war began, it belonged to them. And as Washington steamed south through the wreckage-strewn waters of Iron Bottom Sound, the admiral allowed himself a single thought, that perhaps the future of war would belong not to those who shouted loudest into the dark, but to those who learned how to see within it. By dawn, the sea had quieted into an unnatural calm. Smoke drifted low across the water, mingling with mist that rose from the cooling wreckage of ships. Oil slicks shimmered like bruises on the surface, marking where destroyers had burned and battleships had gone down. The sun climbed slowly above the jagged line of Guadalcanal, pale and exhausted, as if the light itself hesitated to return to a place that had seen such violence. On the flag bridge of USS Washington, Admiral Willis A. Lee watched the morning unfold with the detached stillness of a man who had seen too much to be comforted by victory. The air still tasted of cordite, and beneath his boots he could feel the deep, rhythmic heartbeat of engines carrying them home through waters haunted by the dead. Around him, the bridge crew moved quietly. The voices that had barked coordinates and firing solutions hours earlier now spoke in half-whispers, the way men do in churches and graveyards. Word came that Kirishima had sunk before sunrise, capsizing under the weight of her own flames. The Japanese task force had withdrawn north, leaving behind crippled ships and scattered lifeboats. The sea between Savo and Guadalcanal, once ruled by the night, belonged now to silence. Lee didn't celebrate. He stood with his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable, eyes fixed on the faint outline of Henderson Field in the distance. The airfield still stood. Guadalcanal was still in American hands. That, and that alone, was the meaning of the night's work. Reports trickled in. 4 destroyers lost, hundreds of sailors gone, South Dakota crippled but afloat. The price of the battle was steep, but not fatal. What mattered was that the Japanese landing force never reached the island. Their transports, still waiting beyond the horizon, had turned back at dawn. The enemy had learned that night what they had never believed possible, that darkness no longer guaranteed advantage. Radar had turned the unseen into the visible. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Americans had won a night battle against the Imperial Navy. Yet the victory would not last in memory. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, analysts reduced it to numbers: tonnage lost, ships damaged, ammunition expended. They called it a tactical success, a narrow escape, a fortunate convergence of timing and chance. Few spoke of the men who had rewritten the language of naval warfare in the black water of Iron Bottom Sound. Fewer still understood what the admiral had accomplished, not just sinking ships, but breaking a myth. For decades, navies had believed the night belonged to the bold and the reckless, to men who could read the sea by instinct and moonlight. Lee had replaced instinct with precision, courage with calculation, and proved that science could pierce even the deepest dark. After the battle, Washington steamed south for repairs. Her decks bore the scars of near misses, her guns stained with powder. The crew moved through their duties in silence, the adrenaline replaced by exhaustion so deep it bordered on numbness. Lee spent most of the voyage in his cabin, writing his after-action report by hand. It was a masterpiece of clarity, spare, unsentimental, devoid of self-praise. He credited radar operators by name, listed every destroyed enemy vessel by range and bearing, and concluded with a single understated sentence: enemy forces were effectively engaged by radar-directed gunfire with satisfactory results. Those few words, buried in an appendix of a naval archive, marked the beginning of a revolution. But revolutions are rarely recognized in their time. As the war dragged on and larger battles consumed the headlines, Leyte Gulf, the Philippine Sea, Okinawa, the night at Guadalcanal faded into a footnote. The Washington herself was eventually retired, her great guns silenced, her radar obsolete within a decade. The men who had trusted those glowing screens scattered across peacetime America, working in shipyards, teaching, farming, raising families. Admiral Lee lived quietly, never seeking the fame his actions had earned. When asked about Guadalcanal, he would only say, "We did our job." History remembers victories by their scale, not by their silence. Yet the night of November 14, 1942, was more than a battle. It was a turning point in how humans fought and saw. The Japanese fleet had entered believing the night was their weapon. They left knowing that darkness had betrayed them. A single battleship, guided not by light but by invisible waves of energy, had stood alone and destroyed an entire task force. The admiral's calm faith in technology had turned survival into strategy. As the morning sun rose higher, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound glittered with fragments of wreckage, burned wood, twisted steel, a single lifeboat drifting without oars. The ship's chaplain read prayers over the loudspeaker, his voice trembling as he spoke the words, "Those who fought and did not return." The crew listened in silence, faces turned toward the sea. For them, the victory was not measured in tonnage or headlines, but in the simple, stubborn fact that they were still alive. When Washington finally cleared the Solomon Islands and the coastline disappeared behind her, Lee stood one last time on the aft deck. The wind carried the scent of fuel and salt, but the air felt different, emptier, older. He looked east toward the rising light and thought of the men who had vanished into the black water the night before. He knew that history would not speak their names. It would speak of ships, not souls. But he also knew something greater, that war is not changed by those who shout, but by those who see further. In the end, that was the legacy of that night. That vision, not volume, decides fate. That technology, when married to courage, can turn darkness into daylight. And that sometimes the men who change history are the ones no one remembers. And as Washington disappeared into the wide Pacific, her radar antennas still turning slowly toward the empty horizon, the admiral's thought lingered in the wind like a quiet benediction. Victory belongs not to those who outgun the enemy, but to those who learn to see in the dark.